Hello, everybody. My name is Arthur Holland Michel, and I am a senior fellow here at the Carnegie Council. And it is wonderful to see you all here. And I'm very excited for the discussion that we are going to be having today, a discussion that promises to be both lively and vivid, but also in certain ways uncomfortable too. So this is going to be the quick sort of overview of what we have in store for you. We have a discussion between myself and the three panelists lined up. We'll run that for about 55 minutes or so. And then, of course, we are very, very eager to hear from you. So at any point in the discussion, but certainly when we do open it up, we ask that you submit your questions in the chat function. Now, just to give you a little bit of context, this is part of a series here at the Carnegie Council where we take a bit of a, shall we say, contrarian position on the topic of AI ethics, to think about what are the inherent limits, if you will, of AI ethics, not purely for the fun of taking down AI ethics and being, rebels in that regard, but to make sure that the discussion is grounded in reality and that the solutions that we all come to together reflect that reality. In the first session of the series, we looked at the very real and tricky and challenging technical limits for achieving ethical AI. And today we're going to look at those societal limits that may get in the way. Just to give you a lay of the land, in the last few years, there has been a very constructive, widespread conversation about the principles that AI should be held to. There are a whole range of these principles, many of which are sort of codified in declarations or shared agreements between institutions and increasingly countries. I would just draw your attention to three in particular that I think are particularly relevant to our discussion today. And that is the notion of fairness, these systems should be fair, transparency, and accountability. And hopefully over the course of the discussion, you'll see why it is that those so central principles may be easier said than accomplished. For that, I am delighted to say that we have three absolute legends of the field who are gracious enough to join us for this event. I couldn't be more excited to have with me today Meredith, Sophia, and Karen. It is a true honor. Meredith is an associate professor at the Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute of New York University and research director at the NYU Alliance for Public Interest Technology. Sophia is an associate professor at the University of California, Los Angeles in the departments of Information Studies and African American Studies. And Karen Howe is the senior AI reporter at the MIT Technology Review. Hi, how are you? Good to see you all. So look,
Hi.
I'm going to start with Meredith. Meredith is the author of an absolutely wonderful book called Artificial Unintelligence. If you don't have it on your bookshelf, I highly encourage you to do something about that as soon as this discussion ends. And in that book, in one of my favorite chapters, chapter 6, People Problems, you have this wonderful line that computer systems are proxies for the people who made them. And so I want you to start us off by telling us about the people who made them, and in particular, the people who are at the sort of heart of the AI revolution, if you will. Give us a bit of a sense of the cultural fabric that we're talking about that has been part of this community since the very beginning.
Well, Arthur, thank you for that wonderful introduction. It is such an honor to be here, and especially to be in conversation with Sophia and Karen. So in terms of people who made our ideas about AI, One of the things that I write about in the book is an idea I call techno-chauvinism, the idea that technology or technological solutions are superior to other solutions. And this is an idea that came from my experience as a computer scientist, where the dominant ethos was the idea that we inside computer science and inside math were somehow smarter than other people or better than other people. And it's simply not true. But there's this kind of snobbery inside the field. There's also a lot of racism and sexism and a feeling that nobody needs to examine their beliefs, examine the structural racism and sexism of the field because math and its descendant computer science are so superior. Right. So this is the attitude that I observed as an insider in the field. I left computer science, I became a journalist, then I came back to it as a data journalist. And I wrote the book, Artificial Unintelligence, out of my experience as a data journalist. And one of the things I did for the book was I did a deep dive into our ideas about technology and society. I did a deep dive into the history of techno-chauvinism. What I discovered was that our ideas about the future of technology and society come from a very small and homogeneous group of people who are mostly white male, Ivy League educated men who trained as mathematicians. And there's nothing wrong with being an Ivy League educated white male mathematician. You know, some of my best friends are like that. But the problem is that people embed their own biases in technology. And when you have a group of people who are largely the same, that group of people has the same blind spots. And so that is what leads to really dangerous, harmful, racist situations like Sophia covers in her magnificent book, Algorithms of Oppression. And that's why you have the fact that Google search is racist, because there is a racism, sexism, ableism problem inside computer science that was inherited from mathematics. It goes back hundreds of years, and the field has never reckoned with it. And also the people who are in the field right now don't think that it's important. And we know differently now. We know that this is crucially important. We know that data rights are the civil rights issue of our time. And we know that we need to do something about it.
In the book, you also talk about the deep strain of libertarianism running through this community. Why do you think that that is so closely associated with these communities? And, how perhaps does that sort of manifest itself in their worldview and how they create these systems?
Oh, that's an interesting question. And not many people ask me about that. So I'm pretty delighted to talk about it. Libertarianism is the default in Silicon Valley. And the reason for that is really interesting. So the early pioneers of the internet, the Stuart Brands and the Marvin Minskys of the world, were hippies. They were, Trustafarians and prep school kids who were living through the 60s and went to live on communes and thought, oh, hey, communes are great. We're going to live beyond the reach of the government. We don't need government giving us rules or whatever. And, all the like hippie stuff. But the thing is that the communes were actually really good places to be a white male. And if you were female on the communes, you were pretty much barefoot, pregnant, and in the kitchen. There were very few people of color on the communes, and the communes all fell apart at the end of the 60s. But the people who lived there said, all right, well, the communes failed, but there's this whole new world that's emerging called cyberspace. So we're going to transport our ideas about communalism and our anti-government rhetoric onto this new sphere. So Stuart Brand is a really important figure in this. because he started the Whole Earth catalog. And then he also started the Well, which was the kind of very first place that we had a real online community. It still exists. It's like really, it's well past its heyday. But when you look really hard, you can see the way that these 1960s hippie ideas got transported into ideas about cyberspace. John Perry Barlow, for example, who wrote the Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace at Davos one year, former lyricist for the Grateful Dead, head of the EFF, heavily into this whole Earth scene. And so libertarianism is what the kind of hippie ethos morphed into. It became the default in Silicon Valley, and this gave rise to the idea that people making technology didn't have to pay attention to rules, didn't have to pay attention to government. And coupled with the privilege, the economic, racial privilege that I talked about earlier, it just gave rise to a really toxic brew that has guided the development of the technological systems that are now so influential over our lives. And it's a really bad scene.
I think that was a really fantastic sort of scene setting of what we're dealing with here. I guess just very quickly, would you say that that ethos lives on in the community?
Very much so. Stuart Brand, still a really influential person. Whole Earth, still a really influential, influential community, influential inspiration. All of your major tech titans subscribe to the same kind of magical thinking. And then we've got the weird culty stuff like the Singularity, or the self-driving car. Who's that self-driving car guy who started his own cult? Oh, Anthony Lewandowski, who thinks he's a god, right? So like there's all kinds of weird stuff happening, and we should not really be giving much credence to it. And we should also pay attention to what these folks are doing. So Marvin Minsky, for example, heavily implicated in the Jeffrey Epstein scandal. You have to look at these folks, look at what they're qualified to talk about, look at what they're not qualified to talk about, and you have to really be judicious. So the more whacked out imaginary stuff about let's all go live on Mars, or let's go seastead, or let's like preserve our brains and freeze them so that we can upload them into a future consciousness. Like, it's nutty and we shouldn't really pay attention to it. And that's not what AI is. AI is math. It's an actual technology. It exists. It's not the Hollywood stuff. It's not the Terminator. It's just math, and it's being used to oppress people, violate people's civil rights. And we really need to change that.
So I'm going to turn from that phenomenal explanation of the kind of cultural underpinnings that we're dealing with here to Sophia. Now, if you've reserved a space on your shelves for artificial unintelligence, I urge you to reserve a space right next to it for Algorithms of Oppression, Sophia's phenomenal book on bias in the technologies that we use every day. Now, my challenge to you, Sophia, is to explain to us how this cultural makeup, if you will, that Meredith has just described to us, manifests itself in harmful ways in the technology that we interact with every day.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. And I love following you, Meredith, because I haven't heard you give that history of Silicon Valley before. It's true, people don't really ask about that very much. But of course, once I sit and listen to you describe it, and I think about, the rationalists and, the technocratic future that so many of these guys want, It's no wonder that then we can, turn around and use everyday technologies that have become ubiquitous. In the case of, a lot of my work has really been on Google and Google search and Google products, because they have come to really replace and displace so many other kinds of knowledge and information, organizations, institutions, ways of thinking about how to find the truth, whatever the truth is, in this world on a variety of different topics. And so, what I have found for years watching Google in particular, but I think we could extend this into some social media companies, and which implement differently, but we could say broadly that there's a total lack of regard for women, for people of color, for poor people. There's a kind of uh, you know set of logics about who is important and who's disposable in these systems. And so one of the ways you see this is when you do searches for different kinds of identities, different kinds of people. You see, for example, who's for sale to the pornography industry, who is hypersexualized, who becomes kind of like a commodity object in these systems. And, over and over again, we see that women, for the most part, and girls are profoundly, you know, uh, used to bring in incredible amount of profits for these systems, and for these companies by misrepresenting us. And of course, the same is true for people of color. So when I say, that we get misrepresented, and I mean, this goes back, it's almost like, um, I'm looking at my book here and I'm thinking about how it was just like a big book of tickets for Google. I mean, there were so many pages of things that were wrong. And then, the software engineers just picked it up and were like, fix, fix, fix. And this, of course, is one of the things that happens for all of us who write about the tech sector, critically, is that they open up a ticket and then try to fix it and pretend like it didn't happen. Um, in the case of my early work, it was about looking at what happens when you look for Black girls and Asian girls and Latina girls, and how pornography or hypersexualized materials websites were the first thing that came up, along with their kind of corollary advertisements. And it's interesting because that's such a banal type of AI. I mean, people, that's not what people think of when they think of AI. They don't think of search engines. They think of, HAL, or they think of Watson, or they think of, some Hollywood fantasy, informed by Star Trek or Star Wars, or, these kind of futures that, again, are imagined by a very narrow band of people in the world about what the future looks like. Weirdly, me and Karen and Meredith don't really show up in that future very often. So, that tells us a lot about how much is lost to broader, not only kind of, the culture of knowledge, the culture of information. What does it mean when large scale advertising platforms really take over the landscape, and that are so easily gamed on one hand, but more importantly, where people with the most money, or industries with the most money and clout, are able to control certain kinds of narratives. And we see this in the realm of politics. It's not just in the realm of identity. The most powerful political action committees are able to control the narrative about political candidates. And, one of the things that has always concerned me is, I'm so grateful to our colleagues who do deep research on social media. I think that's incredibly important. We must really take note of what monopolies in the tech space, monopoly social media companies, monopoly search industries, what they do, and how important it is to address that. But the difference between social media and something like a basic AI like search is that people are much more aware of the subjectivities of social media. I mean, they know that they're following people, they know other people are following them, they know that there are hashtags they follow, or, how they use it. It's much more apparent that you're in kind of a particular bubble of your community, even communities you don't want to be a part of anymore that pull you into them, like your friends from high school or whatever, junior high school. But in the case of AI like search, we're talking about people using that like a fact checker, like a truth teller, like an infinite knowledge portal. I mean, people have a really interesting imaginaries about what search is. That it's a giant multinational advertising platform is not the first thing that comes to mind. And so this, of course, is one of the reasons why, what we've seen over and over is, those of us who are, let's say, adversarial subjects in these spaces, right? People who are part of communities that are misrepresented or that are harmed by these technologies. We have been the scholars and journalists who've done the hard work too of making these things legible. I mean, Meredith and Karen know 10 years ago, if we tried to have this conversation, people would think we were from Mars. I mean, they would just completely deny this. But of course now, I mean, I know because 10 years ago when I was writing a dissertation, nobody wanted to hear that math could be racist. But of course, we're not just talking about numbers encoded. We're talking about where math meets society is racist. That's what we're talking about. These mathematical formulations are never an abstraction. They are always social. They're socio-technical systems. So this is why we have to have these conversations. And I think those of us who come from communities where there's been incredible harm understand that the deployment of these technologies are profoundly unequal, uneven, and work in various oppressive ways.
Now, I do want to get to Karen in just a moment, but a very quick follow-up for you, Sophia. Your book received a lot of very well-deserved attention. As I understand it, some of the individual cases that you discovered and reported on in the book were subsequently addressed, if you will. But in the months since I've read the book, and I'm sure you've done the same, every so often I get on Google just to see if I can find more examples of problematic AI biases, and it is not difficult. I mean, within 30 seconds, you can find an example. And I encourage everybody here present today to do exactly that, because it is absolutely chilling. But my question to you is, Google knows about your book. I mean, people know that these things happen. Why is it that they were able to solve those individual cases that you pointed to, but that it's still so easy to find instances of unfairness, if you will?
Well, for the most part, what happens in search is that troubling results that maybe capture the media's attention, that go viral, in other social media systems, they just get downranked for the most part. They just get shoved way down so that they're not entirely visible. But the underlying logics of how this search technology works doesn't change. So, it's just a lot of triaging. It's a lot like whack-a-mole, just as the problems pop up, they're just trying to tamp them down. And, this has brought Google a lot of criticism because, in the early years, really, and still to some degree, this happens. Google will argue that it's the user's fault. You use the wrong words to look for what you're looking for, which is ludicrous, right? So, again, trying to disavow responsibility for its own product and its own technologies. And that's just untenable. You are responsible for the products that you make and how they work in the world. So, they've received a lot of criticism when very famous, let's say, a horribly racist image of former First Lady Michelle Obama gets put into Google image search. It's extremely racist and derogatory. It's been photoshopped. It's horrific. I don't even want to describe it. And the White House responds and says, that's unacceptable. We need that image taken down. You know, a lot of people are watching and arguing if Google does that, then right, it's catering to certain kinds of people in society that other people don't have those kinds of privileges and powers. So, you know, it's backed itself into a corner by saying that anything that shows up in its product is really the result of what the public has done. It's not their responsibility. But then when, you know, things that are like a national security issue or things that, you know, are offensive to people with power, then Google has to address it. What we also know is that outside of the United States, Google must comply, as must Facebook, Amazon, eBay. I mean, every major platform has to comply with the laws in the countries where they do business. So in Germany and France, for example, it's illegal to traffic in neo-Nazi or Nazi paraphernalia, imagery, ideas. Anti-Semitism is illegal. So Google is able to go in, as is Facebook and many other companies, and they spend out an incredible amount of money and resource, mostly human beings, including some AI, to take down that content and make sure that it doesn't move around freely because it's against the law, and they will face incredible, you know, millions of dollars in fines. So this tells us that one, these problems can't entirely be solved by AI because human beings must adjudicate and make these decisions. And this is where the whole work of around content moderation is important. It also tells us that the logics that are exported, the kind of free speech logics exported from the United States and from Silicon Valley, don't work everywhere in the world. And so the company must invent different kinds of business practices to manage that. And it also tells us that these platforms are not just free speech zones, the way in which they like to pretend that they are. And part of the reason they want to say that they're total free speech zones and they do not interfere algorithmically or with moderators to any degree is so that they're not responsible as publishers. Because then they actually have a whole set of other laws that govern them by the Federal Communication Commission. So, you know, these are like the, you know, part of the landscape of the challenges. And this is why they can't fix the underlying logic of the technology because it's an advertising portal. It's meant to be gamed. It's meant to be optimized for maximum profit. It's not designed to be a fairness machine that's an arbiter of culture and ideas and knowledge in our society. And so this is one of the reasons why, you know, they'd have to kind of probably toss out most of it and start over to do that. And why do that? Because we have libraries all over the world who are already doing that important work of curating knowledge.
No, thank you so much, Sophia. And I think that's a phenomenal point to pivot on, this notion that if we want this stuff to stop, if we want things to be fair and transparent and safe and accountable, it's going to take something really fundamental, a fundamental shift. And that is where I'm delighted to say Karen's important work comes in. I encourage everybody to reserve that third spot on their shelves for a subscription to MIT Technology Review, if for nothing else than for Karen's wonderful reporting on AI and the AI industry. I should just say as a very quick aside that in this discussion, we are focusing on some of the big tech giants, but I want you to sort of extrapolate that thinking and some of these examples as we talk to something that's really pervasive throughout the tech industry. But with that in mind, and given that we are realizing that we're in this moment that this shift has to be so profound, I'm wondering, Karen, if you can give us a bit of a landscape of where the discussion is today vis-a-vis getting these companies to actually make good on their promises of ethical AI.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much, Arthur. And I have so many thoughts on this, so I'm going to try and make it as succinct as possible and weave in as many themes as I can articulately. And I also want to say that Meredith and Sophia have done such incredible scholarship and also set up this conversation so well today. So drawing on what Meredith was saying about the history of how the internet and the tech industry was built. It's on this idea of libertarianism, this idea, this assumption that there doesn't need to be rules, that all speech is equal, that data is truth. That then trickles into the things that Sophia is talking about, where this industry, this tech industry, is built off of this technology that assumes that if you just feed data into a system, it somehow produces something of value. And that it somehow is like completely detached from all of the issues in society. And the challenge that we're facing now, where the tech industry is starting to realize, oh, wait, this is not necessarily true, and we need to be more ethical in the way that we approach technology. They've realized that from a very superficial and surface level of, okay, now let's produce technologies that have these nice buzzwords we can attach onto them, like fairness, transparency, accountability. But there's not this deeper understanding of where the problem actually manifested from. So part of the issue is that AI as a field and as a technology is always talked about in the abstract. It's sort of assumed that it exists in this ephemeral space that is completely unrelated to the humans and the earth and like the material world around us. And the problem then is when you're only talking about things in the abstract, you don't really go and tackle some of the root issues. Like the fact that we keep seeing a technology like search AI continually manifest these really racist or sexist ideologies is because they're not actually tackling the issue from the cultural problem. Like the culture that we live in is what generates the data that is fed into these machines that then spits out these racist and sexist ideologies. So if you just assume that the data is still fine and the culture that we live in is still fine, and you're just trying to tweak the actual algorithm, you're not going to get very far, because it's still coming, the data that we produce is still coming from the same place of this very sexist and racist history. And so what I've sort of found is the landscape of AI ethics today is there's just a lot of ethics washing, because there isn't really this grasp of what it actually means for an algorithm to be anti-racist, not just fair, but anti-racist, and to be understandable, not just transparent, but like actually have people who are using it, who are subject to it, understand it. Like transparency is an interesting term, because it is like transparent to whom, like, and who is making it transparent? Like it's completely abstracted from the people that are making the decisions, the people that produce the culture that we live in, the people that are then subjected to these algorithmic systems. And the same thing with accountability. Like it's, again, it completely abstracts these notions away from society. And so there isn't like a very precise understanding of who actually are we talking about, and what actually are we talking about to make these systems better.
Searching frantically for the mute key, very 2021. Now, as an aside, because you did reference it, although in a very modest and indirect way, your glossary of buzzwords for the AI industry, I'm going to ask one of the producers to put it in the chat. It just came out, I think, last week, and it is a sadly humorous take on where things are with AI ethics today. I'd ask maybe just if you could perhaps give us a little detail on some of your reporting, for example, on Facebook and the story about how Facebook has become addicted to AI. You talked in there, for example, about its interest in de-biasing, so making AI fairer, being really driven by a business case more than anything else. Could you tell us any more about sort of what you found in that story and how it relates to what we're seeing and talking about today in terms of the sort of societal underpinnings that we're up against?
Yeah, so this Facebook story was a 9-month investigation that I did into Facebook's responsible AI team. And this story began when Facebook reached out to me saying that they were interested in having me do some kind of deeper dive into their AI work. And as I was meeting with different leadership within the AI org, I realized that Facebook had a responsible AI team, which was news to me. And it had had one or some form of one for 3 years. And this was back in the summer of last year. And I was just really intrigued by what on earth has Facebook's responsible AI team been doing for the past 3 years? Because a lot of the conversations that we were having then are still conversations that we're having now about the way that foreign actors can weaponize these algorithmic targeting systems to interfere with elections, the fact that advertisers can use it to discriminate against different users. And what I found is that Facebook's responsible AI team is sort of like the epitome of the way that I think it really epitomizes some of the flaws of the way that the tech industry has been approaching this idea of responsible AI. The people that were working on this thing, they were all, the initial people that started it all had very technical backgrounds, all were machine learning, computer science people who were just waking up to this idea that math is not neutral, AI is not neutral. And when they started looking into what they should do about that, they then found these ideas: fairness, accountability, transparency, and they made their responsible AI team like have those pillars. I think their 3 pillars are fairness, privacy, and transparency. The issue is these things, like responsible AI is not defined by just some vague words. Responsible AI means you need to understand what harms your algorithmic systems are perpetuating and then figure out how to actually mitigate those harms. And like the problem was Facebook kind of plucked these 3 words out of like the vacuous space that is AI ethics without actually thinking about how it interfaces with their technologies. And then they decided to pursue these 3 things. But if you think about like what are the actual algorithmic harms of Facebook, things like amplifying misinformation, things like polarizing users, that's not actually addressed by these 3 buckets: fairness, privacy, and transparency. And one of the other issues that happened is Facebook was very excited to present to me their fairness work because that was the work that they felt was most developed, that they really wanted to parade around the world and demonstrate that Facebook had finally taken responsible AI seriously. But as I was saying before, these words, they are vacuous because they don't have an understanding of power or context, like fair to whom. So fairness or any of these words, they have this like squishiness where you can interpret it in many different ways based off of essentially what's useful to the business. And in Facebook's case, what had happened was they were even before they built the tools to measure fairness and try and make fairer algorithms, there was already this idea of fairness that existed at the company within the policy team that meant like fair meant to them equal treatment of like US conservative and US liberal users. And one of the reasons why they adopted that specific definition is because it's great for the business. If you can continue to pretend that Facebook is neutral, that it's treating everyone equally, then you can sort of ward off regulation, especially when there's a conservative government in power. But one of the really bad side effects of this kind of like vacuous interpretation of fairness is that then that interpretation directly undermined some of the ways that other employees were actually trying to tackle more deep-seated responsible AI problems, like fixing misinformation. Like as I write about in my story, there was like an engineer that I spoke to, or an AI researcher that I spoke to, who their team was actively trying to develop AI to catch misinformation. But because in our political context, in the past 4 years, there's been a lot of conspiracy theories that are specifically attached to the conservative political leanings. These AI algorithms that were meant to catch misinformation then affected conservative users more than liberal users, and therefore, under their definition of fairness, should not be deployed. And so they were like actively creating these systems and then having them taken out of the platform and prevented from being deployed because of fairness. So I think Facebook is it is a bit more of an egregious example because of its power, influence, and size as a company. But these themes echo throughout the tech industry, where the people that are driving the responsible AI initiatives don't necessarily understand what they're actually doing. They just pluck these terms from the general AI ethics discourse. And then in the end, because of business incentives, because of other reasons, those terms actually then make everything worse rather than better.
I think with that, we've really put together a solid overview of what we're dealing with here. And so what I want to do now is bring you all in to kind of tie this all together, if you will. My sense is that in the discussion of AI ethics, there often seems to be this assumption that everyone's on board with the principles of ethical AI. And to be sure, if you look at all the marketing copy, everyone does seem to be on board with these principles. No one's going to raise their hand and say, actually, no, I don't want AI to be safe or fair or transparent. But the stories you all shared today tell a very different narrative. And it makes me wonder whether there are actually fundamental and intractable ideological differences among the parties to this issue, and that might actually be the fundamental barrier that we're up against. That, to put it in plain terms, not everybody is on board with this. So with that in mind, I'd actually like to circle back to Meredith, but I want you all to come in on this. So maybe Meredith, Sophia, and then Karen, if you can give me, am I right in saying this, or is that too pessimistic a take?
Well, I think that there's a certain amount of truth here. What computers can do is computers can do math. And that's all they can do. They're not human beings. I think that it was just so much fun listening to Kara and Sophia, because they're just right. That's really all there is to it. They're just correct. But I think that there are a couple of really flawed assumptions at work in the AI narrative. The first is the idea that we're going to be able to write once and run anywhere and have AI or have algorithms that are going to govern speech in every topic, in every country, in every community in the world. Like, it's just enormous hubris. It's not possible. And so one of the really interesting things is the way that big tech digs into this idea that it's possible to do a thing that is not actually possible, but they just keep pretending that it is. So social media algorithms, for example, can figure out what is popular, but they can't figure out what is good. Because what's good is a social decision. It comes out of a social context. And popularity has been used as a proxy for good in a lot of places. But the thing is that there are a lot of things in the world that are popular but not good, like racism or conspiracy theories or ramen burgers, right? And good is something that is socially determined. It's contextual. And computers can't do that. They've never been able to do that. They're never going to be able to do that. So the belief that we can write an AI that's going to adjudicate everything is just deeply flawed. And I think that it goes back to this techno-chauvinist idea that somehow we're going to be able to build machines that we're going to replace humans, that we're going to be able to build machines that are better than humans. And again, it's hubris. So we should just like stop pretending that it's possible. I mean, the case of self-driving cars is actually a really good case of this, because people have been pretending for many, many years that it's going to be possible to make a self-driving car, that the self-driving car is not going to go out there and kill people, that we're going to have the glorious future. We were promised it in 2020. We were promised that AI was going to drive cars and none of us would be driving anymore. And, you know, I'm still driving my car, and 2 people just died yesterday or the day before in a Tesla autopilot crash.
Sophia, I want you to jump in here.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm ready. Well, listen, I mean, there's a reason why certain words get picked up and deployed and other words get left on the table. All right. So I want to, go straight to the heart of why fairness, accountability, and transparency. When we've used other words like oppression, civil and human rights abuses, discriminatory, right? So those words are left on the table by these same kinds of academic industry, partnerships. And I've been around a long time. So I remember when the fairness, accountability, transparency movement started. As kind of a project under ACM, and a number of my former professors and colleagues, became a part of that movement, which really is the movement that was kind of picked up by industry. That effort was actually, some of the very people who were a part of kind of founding this AI ethics effort were in direct opposition to feminist scholars and critical race scholars, people who were using words like oppression, people who were talking about racial discrimination and sexism baked into these projects. They were not interested in those social dimensions of the problems. They were interested in making more perfect technology, more perfect algorithms. And that's what the impulse for that movement in its kind of early stages of organizing, that's who was in the room. They were looking at things like, how do we distribute the chance of harm randomly across the entire population instead of having it just hit, let's say, African Americans. But see, the fundamental logics that Meredith is talking about, which is this temerity to think that you could somehow perfect the algorithm or perfect the technology, and really as a way to obfuscate or not deal with the kinds of things that we're talking about, which are issues of broad and deep global inequality, racial wealth gap, increasing economic inequality, which grows every single year that we record inequality. Every year it grows greater than the year before. Disparity in the distribution of resources in our societies. See, people who are interested many times in not talking about those things, which are considered like social issues, right? I guess for others to care about, and are instead interested in how do we make a more perfect AI, really have a whole new industry that they can play in to, again, as Karen so powerfully put it, kind of ethics wash or not deal. Even the idea, I mean, I have to say that when I wrote 10 years ago, when I was working on this, the origins of the book, and I was using words like ethics, it didn't mean what it means today, because there was no AI ethics industry. There was no cottage industry. So it was interesting to me. I mean, the context within which I was using it was to talk about structural oppression, but to lift up a word like ethics, which really has no legal basis, right? It's really about kind of personal moral culpability or not? Are you a good person or not in relationship to how you use these? It's a little bit like corporate social responsibility. Do you know, it kind of moves into that realm. Well, then it actually leaves the companies in a place where they can keep hyper focused on the technology, and they don't have to deal with other broader corporate practices. For example, how is it that we have so much global inequality and 7 of the 10 most well-capitalized companies on planet Earth are tech companies? What does it mean that tech companies don't pay taxes and they offshore their profits? What does it mean that they use profoundly the public infrastructure and they pay very little into it? What about what happens when big tech moves to your city and everything's gentrified sometimes just by the announcement and the speculation that they're coming to your town? I mean, these are really profound issues that I think when we focus on fairness, accountability, transparency, ethical AI, we don't actually have to look at broader corporate practices. And this is just like the greenwashing movement of fossil fuel industry, right? Or other kinds of industries. I mean, we've seen this a million times. And I think we're going to have to get serious and broaden up the conversation. And to me, this is why it's important to have these conversations and to remember what we're really talking about when we're using these words.
Thanks, Sophia.
I want to jump in here because
please.
I really love what Sophia was mentioning about these words and how the words themselves are problematic in the way that we talk about these things. And it reminds me of this passage from the book Data Feminism that I would love to just like very quickly read because it's so relevant. And this was a chapter or an excerpt that was pointed out to me by Ria Kaluri, who is a Stanford AI researcher and also co-creator of the Radical AI Collective, which attempts to challenge a lot of these more like vacuous approaches to AI ethics. And so in Data Feminism, which is written by Catherine D'Ignazio and Lauren Klein, it says, thus far, the major trend has been to emphasize the issue of bias and the values of fairness, accountability, and transparency in mitigating its effects. This is a promising development, especially for technical fields that have not historically foregrounded ethical issues and as funding mechanisms for research on data and ethics proliferate. However, as Ruha Benjamin's concept of imagined objectivity helps to show, addressing bias in a data set is a tiny technological band-aid for a much larger problem. Even the values mentioned here, which seek to address instances of bias in data-driven systems, are themselves non-neutral as they locate the source of the bias in individual people and specific design decisions. So how might we develop a practice that results in data-driven systems that challenge power at its source? The following chart introduces an alternative set of orienting concepts for the field. And this chart has 2 columns. The first one says concepts that secure power because they locate the source of the problem in individuals or technical systems. And then the second column is concepts that challenge power because they acknowledge structural power differentials and work toward dismantling them. So in column 1, it says ethics. In column 2, it says justice. In column 1, it says bias. In column 2, oppression. Column 1, fairness. Column 2, equity. Column 1, accountability. Column 2, co-liberation. And column 1, transparency. Column 2, reflexivity. And I think that this just is, I just like love this passage so much because it really cuts through a lot of the challenges with the field. AI ethics as a field today is just, even the language that we're using is still building on this notion of libertarianism that founded the field initially. And so if we shift the language in the tradition of abolitionists, in the tradition of feminists, we can begin to really grasp at what we're talking about.
You know,
100%.
and it's several of you mentioned this notion of the tech band-aid, right? Like the debiasing band-aid. But as we did cover in our session on the technical limits of AI ethics, even just that quote unquote tiny little issue of debiasing AI actually presents enormous technical challenges that are just dizzying the second that you get into them. So even to divert to technological solutions is potentially problematic too. Now, at this point, I'm seeing that there are some really fantastic questions coming in, obviously, because you gave us such a wonderful picture of what we're dealing with here. What I'm going to do is read a number of these questions in one go and open it up to you to pick and choose as you wish. There was one question quite a little bit earlier about how the communities that build these systems, the tech industry, is getting more diverse in some respects in recent years, and whether this is changing the intellectual outlook of the field at all. There's also a question about the notion of whether there should be tough laws to enforce this stuff. If the industry isn't going to do this on their own, do we need to turn to regulation? A question about where the three principles come from and whether there is a AI ethics industry. Tricky one there. And then I'm going to finish with this last one because I see another batch just coming in. Whether the people who use these tools are responsible. This esteemed audience member says that they can't get their friends to give up Facebook, Instagram, and that they themselves still use Twitter and Google Docs. In that regard, are they responsible? I'm going to throw that all out to you, please. Whoever wants to have a go at any one of those, you have the floor.
Well, let me jump in and say I'm so glad we're talking about language and what are the implications for AI ethics and AI fairness? Because as a computer scientist and as a writer, I feel like I think a lot about navigating issues of language and issues of precision. So when you're writing a computer program, you are writing using a vocabulary and a grammar that the computer understands. And the underlying structure of a computer program is not unlike the underlying structure of a piece of writing. But in programming, precision is incredibly important. If you have a semicolon missing, then the whole thing blows up or you get a totally different result. And so you have to be very, very exacting about your words. This is one of the things that's kind of satisfying about it, honestly, because you do all this precision and then you get this huge rush when it actually works because you've been like banging your head against the wall for so long. So this kind of precision that you need in order to do computer science is in many ways different than the kind of precision you need for writing, because in writing, we can say something like fairness, and the audience will come and bring their own interpretation to it. And the concept of fairness will trigger thinking on behalf of the reader. And the reader will bring this whole wealth of experience to it and will have this wonderful, wonderful mind expanding experience. Not the same in computing. And so when I think about the way that you would need to program for fairness, I think, oh yeah, that's really hard. Right? It is a really hard computational problem. And in fact, it's not actually possible. So what I think about here is I think about a metaphor, a kind of extended metaphor around fairness. And I think about a cookie, right? So when I was little and there would be one cookie left in the world, my little brother, or one cookie left in the house, not in the world. There's one cookie left in the house. My little brother and I are going to have a fight about that cookie. And so if a computer were sent in to adjudicate this fight, the computer would say, okay, well, mathematically, what's fair is we just divide the cookie in half and each child gets 50%, and then everybody's going to be fine. And that's how we should solve it. And that's true. That is the mathematically fair way to solve the problem of a scarce resource. But in the real world, when you break a cookie in half, it doesn't actually break 50-50, it breaks into a big half and a little half. And so if I wanted the big half, I would say to my brother, okay, you take the little half now, and I will let you pick the TV show that we watch after dinner. And my brother would think about it for a second. He would say, okay, that sounds fair. So that was a socially fair decision. Now, mathematical fairness and social fairness are not the same thing. So you can program a computer for mathematical fairness, but you can't program a computer for social fairness. So when, as Karen said, we change our frame to justice, it gives us a totally different way of thinking about this, and thinking about the cookie gives us a good way of thinking about what is impossible and what is possible with computing.
Yeah, and I'll jump in and let me just add on the issues of taking up a little bit of a different question. I think certainly regulation is crucial, because the industry writ large, left to its own devices, will do whatever is most profitable because that is their mandate. We don't want to forget that publicly traded companies are beholden to their shareholders. And that means they are also beholden to maximize profit for those shareholders. Now, that creates quite a conundrum when these technologies are used in ways that are motivated by purely the profit imperative first, but they are used to displace other kinds of public, democratic institutions. So, we see this all the time. For example, when teachers and parents, instead of having students go, again, a plug for the libraries, to the library, or to ask their teacher or their professor, or to have access to the university, there's instead a new culture of just Googling it. That means that large-scale advertising companies, again, step in as a proxy for other kinds of knowledge and public goods, writ large public goods. We can see this, of course, in a time of COVID-19, when a pandemic that laid bare how fragile so many of our public goods are. The fact that the most searched for terms in Google are always around health. So what does that tell us? It tells us that Google search is the medical health, public health proxy as a stand-in for not having a public health system that everyone can participate in. So, there's so many ways that these companies are working as a proxy for the public goods that they've been directly responsible for defunding by not paying taxes, again, that we have to have some type of regulatory environment that both looks at that, the tension and the balance between certain sectors of the economy and what's good for the social welfare of the publics in this country. And of course, other countries are doing this. We're way behind. The United States is way behind. We also have to ask ourselves, why is it that the United States can be, and this is here borrowing from the work of people like Professor Danielle Citron, law professor at University of Virginia, who helps us understand how the United States is a safe haven for some of the worst kinds of tech companies in the world. So if you want to, for example, open up a company that is just for the express purpose of stalking people, bullying people, engaging in non-consensual pornography postings, or what we colloquially understand as revenge porn, the United States is where you open up those companies. We're the haven, like the Cayman Islands is the tax haven. The United States is the haven for the worst kinds of tech companies. So all of that is part of it. We're not just talking about the brand name technologies. We're talking about how the sector works with kind of a lawless type of culture and set of imperatives that really, I think, we can see undermine democracy, increase threat and harm, maximize the potential for hate crime and other kinds of acts of violence in our society. I mean, we're going to have to reckon with that and contend with it. There's just no getting around it. And of course, we haven't even begun to scratch the surface in this conversation. We could spend a whole nother hour talking about predictive analytics and predictive technologies that are all about classifying and sorting everyone in our society into opportunity and out of opportunity. And we're seeing the evidence of this in banking, finance, mortgages, education, access to, admissions into college, just distribution of healthcare. I could go on and on. So, these things are, we are, I think, at an incredibly important moment in history where we're either going to grab a hold of this and contend with it. It's akin to me, the civil rights movement of the 1960s. We are in that kind of a struggle right now where we are fundamentally dealing with rights and opportunities and enfranchisement and disenfranchisement and power and domination. And we have a responsibility to make these concerns legible rather than natural and normal.
I want to totally agree with what Sophia said, and also point out that regulation is what we need right now, because for many years we've been under the delusion that tech companies have given us that self-regulation was the way to go. And self-regulation has failed. We gave it a chance. It has profoundly failed. And now it's time for government regulation to ensure that people's civil rights are preserved inside tech platforms.
Yeah, I think just to jump in here, I think ultimately, to sort of summarize what we've been talking about for over an hour now, it's like, as you try to unpack what's wrong with AI today, inevitably the conversation goes to what's wrong with society today. And to kind of return to the question that you had initially asked us, Arthur, like, how feasible is it for us to actually develop ethical AI today? Probably not, because like we haven't yet arrived at a society that has the values that we would want for a future, has the values that we would want to codify into AI to supposedly bring us this future. But I think for me personally, I am optimistic though, because the AI community and the people that are building AI is a very nebulous thing. It's expanding. The walls of like what defines this community is expanding a lot. There are more and more people that are coming in from non-technical backgrounds, from different ethnically diverse and socioeconomically diverse backgrounds. And through expanding the people that are involved, and hopefully my dream is that everyone in the world would be involved ultimately in building this technology, we can sort of like have a much deeper discussion and push and change the industry, transform our society and this technology towards something that is more ethical, more just, and all the things that we've talked about.
It feels in a certain way that part of what we're getting at, to sort of bring things full circle, is that just as the technology is itself a proxy for the people who made it, the solutions are necessarily perhaps a proxy for the people who get to or want to implement them. And not everyone is perhaps in agreement as to what the best way to do that is. And if there isn't that alignment, we have a challenge right there. I want to throw a few more questions at you. They're coming in like lava in the chat. We have a really interesting one. Whether you think that, which do you think is more of the problem? This is an A-B question. A, there is still a huge gap among ethicists, philosophers, and people in the tech industry. Or B, is the bigger problem that in many ways the discipline of ethics and philosophy itself is pretty uncollected, biased, and colonial. And as a quick sort of follow-up to that, what is a dream course that or set of readings that you would want to get your students to engage with in order to become future quote-unquote AI justice designers? And how does that interact with the point about the philosophy and ethics field? There's a question about actually go ahead. No, please, absolutely. Please. You got it.
Just super fast. I loved last year, I taught in one of my classes to my students in information studies. We read Charles Mills's The Racial Contract. And, Mills is a MacArthur genius and an incredible philosopher. Um, and one of the things that was really eye-opening for them is they really didn't understand, let's say, the origin story of Western Enlightenment thinking and how profoundly implicated it is in being used to do things like uphold the transatlantic slavery or the institution of enslavement of African peoples, used as a justification for the expansion, westward expansion, and the occupation of indigenous peoples' lands throughout the Americas. So part of what's challenging, and I've actually seen, computer science faculty try to teach ethics in computer science in response to these have been, fun to see go around Twitter, where, they're teaching Enlightenment theories. And, many of us are like, that's not it. That's not what we're talking about. So there's a lot of excellent critique of the way in which philosophy is an incredibly troubled field, at least in the way that it's taught in the United States. And that is, going back to that origin story actually is part of the problem. I mean, even if you go back and come into Western civilization, Aristotle, Plato, I mean, there are many critics outside of the United States who would argue that our hyper reliance, for example, on Aristotle as part of and binary logics and the kind of the racist origins and sexist origins of classification logics are part of the underlying problem that we have with AI in the United States now. So there are different points of view about this, different ways of coming to know and think about AI. When I talk to my Chinese colleagues, for example, who are computer scientists and work in machine learning, they outside of the United States, they will tell me that part of the problem is our own orientation philosophically toward the way we organize AI logics. And so I think these things these are philosophical questions, and there are many different philosophies one can draw down from around the world, and people in fact do. So I think we want to remember that this is also where the flattening of these concepts to like just math also make it really difficult to apprehend that philosophies are also some of them, many of them, racist and sexist and binary in nature. And in their logics, and some of them even arguing for the dehumanization of anyone that's not white or European, of European descent. So, you're going to have to contend with that if you want to talk about the origin story of philosophy that underlies some of our principles too.
So here's a little more mid-air refueling, if you will, to carry us out through the end of the hour. We have a question about how you can regulate these companies if they are becoming as powerful as and starting to behave indeed like governments. There's also a question around whether talking about, for example, race and facial recognition is indeed the right direction, as opposed to whether we should really be talking about using facial recognition at all. And on the tail end of that, a question around whether really one of the fundamental issues here is privacy regulation, and if sort of more should be pushed into that, whether it's achievable and foundational, thinking about issues that haven't actually come up so far in conversation around, for example, consumer rights and control over the data that is collected about us. I'm going to leave it there because I want to give you all a chance to have a stab at anything else that has come up in the chat. But I also want us to hold off for the last 3 minutes of discussion because I've got one last exercise for you, if you will. But at this point, I will open it up. Does anyone want to address any of what has just come in from our dear audience?
I can take the facial recognition one. And what was the one before facial recognition?
About these companies being sort of as powerful as governments.
Yes, about regulation. Okay.
Yeah.
It's a problem, and we also need to look at the way that that the big 9 tech companies are spending enormous amounts of money on lobbying. In terms of who should write the regulation, I am right here. I am waiting to do it. I am ready. I am volunteering. I've been volunteering for a while. So hopefully I will just keep saying this, and somebody will take me up on it sooner or later. Okay. So independent people writing regulation right here. And it needs to be done. In terms of facial recognition, I'm assuming everybody has seen Coded Bias, has seen how terrific Sophia is in Coded Bias. And it is, thank you, a lot of fun. Joy Bolomwini's work is at the center of Coded Bias. And Joy Bolomwini is the researcher who brought it to the world's attention that facial recognition systems discriminate, that they're better at recognizing lighter skin than darker skin, they're better at recognizing men than recognizing women, and they totally ignore the existence of trans, non-binary, and other gender non-conforming folks. Deeply problematic, racist, discriminatory. Lots of people say, okay, well, the way to solve this problem is to put more people of color into the training data sets that are used to train the facial recognition algorithms. And Joy's work is really important because she says, no, that will make the facial recognition algorithms better at recognizing people of color, but really, we should not be using these systems at all. So she pushes the argument forward into an argument for justice. And the reason we should not be using these systems is that facial recognition systems are disproportionately weaponized against communities of color, against poor communities in policing. And the way that we make a world that is more just is not by making these systems better, it's by not using these systems at all. So we need to push the conversation beyond, oh, how can we improve the technology? And question the uses of technology in the first place and really examine what kind of a world do we want to create? And do we really want to be using these technological systems to continue to discriminate and oppress? And I would argue, no, we don't, and we shouldn't.
I think we will definitely see more consumer rights and civil rights orientation in the regulation framework. I mean, most of regulation right now is really focused on data privacy in particular, even kind of GDPR in the EU. But I think there is definitely, as more evidence comes to light around things like algorithmic discrimination, as well as other types of, let's say, concerns that would maybe afford the public the right to sue for damages. And I saw that question in the chat. I mean, I think that we will definitely see, I mean, New York has been a perfect example, and even Texas now. New York's state AG, Tish James, don't mess with her. She's, any companies that in New York are discriminating algorithmically and in that tech sector are on her watch list. So I think we'll see more at the states level. This is really important because the states are places where consumers or people in the country can sue for damages, and we certainly need that. I mean, this is one of the things that Kathy O'Neill in her great book Weapons of Math Destruction says, at the time that she was writing the book, she argued you can't take an algorithm to court. This is a challenge. So the framing of the kinds of harms that we've been talking about, and so many more that we haven't even addressed yet, definitely, I think we will start to see more. We're seeing members of the Congressional Black Caucus, Representative Yvette Clarke, we're seeing Senator Cory Booker, many who are looking at algorithmic accountability in terms of bringing new legislation into place. You know, all of our favorite Federal Trade Commissioner, Rohit Chopra, who's been amazing and an amazing, even in the minority, voice and opinion on the Federal Trade Commission around things like the unfairness doctrine and the, you know, penalties that companies will have to face. So I think there are mechanisms and spaces already, you know, kind of government-wise to do that work. Part of it will be the will of the people who work in those agencies and as our representatives to enact and enforce. But also part of it is the role of journalists like Karen, who can translate what's at stake here to broader publics so that the public can really apprehend and understand these conversations and really understand how their own consumer and civil rights are being violated.
Now, I know that the topics we've discussed today do not necessarily leave us feeling optimistic or cheery about the future. As you've also brilliantly pointed out, there are tremendous challenges ahead. But in our last 2 minutes, I want to ask each of you to share with us something that does give you hope and optimism in this regard, or not, even if it, I mean, Meredith, I saw you had a very cute little puppy in your video, so it can be that too, but please do end us on a note of what does give you optimism. And Karen, I'm gonna hand it over to you first in that regard. Go ahead.
I think what makes me optimistic is the fact that we're even having this conversation. As both Meredith and Sophia have mentioned, this was not a conversation that we could have had a few years ago. So the fact that we're talking about it openly, that we're identifying these challenges, that's the first step to actually solving them. And I'm grateful for that.
Yeah, I'll give Meredith the last word. I'm really, you know, I'm excited to see so many more students in particular. I mean, I see this at UCLA, more students who want to be involved in these conversations, more engineering students who come and take classes from those of us who kind of teach more of the sociological dimensions of computing and technology. There's definitely a lot of energy in this generation that are undergraduates right now around these conversations, which is also very different. 10 years ago, my students were in complete denial that any of these things were real or possible, and they really considered them one-offs. Now, my students are like, we see it and not on our watch. So that's, you know, for sure exciting. I mean, they are, I think it's actually going to be incumbent upon the rest of the world to catch up, so to speak, and support that energy. I mean, the truth is we're living at a time with so much economic and social and political precarity that something's got to give. And we should not be rushing toward a technocratic future where we score those who are worthy of having food and those who are worthy of being able to cross a border and travel, and those who are not, those who are worthy of having shelter and those who are not. I mean, we're going to have to deal with really the fundamental issues that also the technology is over determining, which is, you know, issues of deepening inequality. And I think as we attend to these kind of technical issues, that's not the point. The point is what's happening in our societies around the world, and how does the technological exacerbate or mitigate? And those are the kinds of questions that I think are on our minds and increasingly on the minds of others.
Yeah, I'm going to totally agree with Sophia and with Karen. I have a pandemic puppy on my lap here, and that is something that gives me hope and inspiration. It's also very grounding. And I think that staying grounded when talking about issues of AI is very, very important. It's extremely important to remember what is real about AI and what's imaginary about AI, because when we get too deep into the imaginary, that's when things start to go off the rails, when we start investing too much in an imaginary and unreasonable future. And I think the thing that I will say is the most inspiring is, as my co-panelist said, the fact that we're even having this conversation at all. Because 10 years ago, this conversation didn't exist. Even probably 5 years ago, this conversation didn't exist. And so talking about it is the only way that we're going to get to any kind of collective understanding about what are all the dimensions of the problem and how can we start trying to attack this problem, not just computationally, but also from a social aspect and also from a regulatory angle as well. So thank you for a great conversation today.
Oh, thank you. Now, this is the moment in the evening in ordinary times that we would all retreat to the cocktail hour, the true event. Alas, we cannot do that, but we'll have to look forward to reconvening in a not too distant future. In the meantime, I encourage everybody assembled here today to please follow the very important work of our esteemed panelists today. And of course, to also join me in giving them a very vigorous virtual round of applause. I also will just say that the transcript of this event will be available on the Carnegie Council website in the next few days, along with a video, as well as obviously our phenomenal calendar of upcoming events that I urge you all to join. With that being said, I'm going to sign off and just thank you all once again so much for being here. This has been an absolute blast, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.